This we do know. A world that begins to witness the rebirth of trust among nations can find its way to a peace that is neither partial nor punitive. With all who will work in good faith towards such a peace, we are ready, with renewed resolve, to strive to redeem the near lost hopes of our day. The first great step along this way must be the conclusion of an honorable armistice in Korea. This means the immediate cessation of hostilities and the prompt initiation of political discussions leading to the holding of free elections in a united Korea. It should mean, no less importantly, an end to the direct and indirect attacks upon the security of Indochina and Malaysia. For any armistice in Korea that merely released aggressive armies to attack elsewhere would be a fraud. We seek, throughout Asia as throughout the world, a peace that is true and total.
Hello, and welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 34, Cry Korea. On the 27th of July, 1953, the Korean War ended. Sort of. We left off last episode with the armistice nearly ready, but not quite ready to be signed. After the issues of prisoners of war and the demarcation line were resolved in late June, just one issue remained. Syngman Rhee was still unwilling to openly commit to the terms of the armistice, threatening to pull the Republic of Korea armed forces out of United Nations command to continue fighting after the completion of the armistice. He had previously given his American colleagues a few conditions he wanted in the final armistice agreement, but these conditions were effectively impossible without equally impossible concessions from the Americans. Rhee's unwillingness to accept the armistice as negotiated at Panmunjom presented the Americans with two problems. One, there's the difficulties created by a key party of a conflict holding out on agreeing to the thing that could end that conflict. And two, there's the signal that sends to the opponent about the internal unity of UN command. This was the diplomatic priority of the Eisenhower administration's first 6 months. By July 5th, Assistant Secretary of State Walter Robertson had slowly worn Rhee's unwillingness down. Robertson arrived in Korea in June as Dwight Eisenhower's emissary and was tasked with convincing Rhee of that which Mark Clark, Ambassador Alice Briggs, and others could not. And Robertson was a good choice for the job, described as an immensely charming person who could convince anyone of nearly anything. After a few days of daily meetings with Rhee, where he used both carrots and sticks, Robertson was still not successful, though. Mark Clark had no choice but to push forward with brandishing one of those sticks, or at least to act like it, and enact his plan to act like UN command was preparing to pull out of Korea. On July 5th, 8th Army Commander Maxwell Taylor, said in an interview that UN withdrawal was possible and would create serious difficulties for the ROKA, given UN command's control of the logistics network in South Korea. This public threat and Robertson's continued cajoling behind the scenes apparently did the trick, because Robertson returned to Eisenhower's Oval Office on the 12th with a signed letter from Rhee assuring Ike that South Korea would not get in the way of an armistice agreement. The old president had finally given in. The final hurdle had been overcome. Of course, it was not just the stick that had worked. Robertson gave Rhee 5 carrots, 5 promises. A post-armistice mutual security treaty, a long-term economic aid agreement, military aid, and 2 guarantees about the South Korean presence at the post-armistice political conference. 4 days before, on July 8th, the Communists finally replied to the American response to the questions the Communists asked in the wake of the re-government's release of non-repatriate POWs on June 18th. The American response included a request to reconvene at Panmunjom, and the Communists actually agreed to that, despite expressing their displeasure with the answers the Americans gave. So they were unhappy with the situation, but they wanted an armistice enough to overlook that for now. The 10, not angry but perturbed with each other, men met at Panmunjom on July 10th, fully prepared to finalize their armistice agreement and end the Korean War. Leading into this meeting, Clark was unable to secure the ability for Harrison to properly answer any of the questions the Communists were sure to pose, with those back in Washington limiting Harrison to giving just vague answers that probably would not satisfy their understandably spooked opponent. The Communists still wanted to know that UN Command could ensure South Korean compliance with the armistice, something even UN Command was unsure of until the 12th. All Harrison could do before that was to promise anything and everything else he could in an attempt to reassure those across the table while buying more time for Reed to come around. On the 11th, the Joint Chiefs clarified to Clark that he did have the authority to pull UN Command out of Korea, but they didn't really want him to do that, and, just don't tell the other guys that. The Joint Chiefs and the State Department wanted Clark to maintain as much flexibility as possible, even if that meant sinking the armistice agreement. During the meeting that day, Nam rejected Harrison's assurances as, in short, not enough. Nam wanted to know that the South Koreans would play ball. Even Harrison's assurances that UN Command sufficiently trusted Rhee to not get in the way of things were not enough. Nam needed more, not just more information to sell the armistice agreement to his superiors, but more time for war. On the 13th, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army launched what they expected to be their final offensive of the war. Their goal was to finally break the bulge in the central sector of the line, and to let the Americans know that the bell had not yet rung, that they were prepared for the war to go on. Crucially, this attack was a purely Chinese attack against purely South Korean defenders. No American divisions and no North Korean divisions were involved in these battles. Peng Dehuai wanted one final victory over the imperialists, and he wanted it to be a Chinese victory over the South Koreans above all else. The propaganda value of such a victory would be immense, beyond the actual military value gained by collapsing the Kumsung Bulge, as the area was known. Peng wanted to have as legitimate as possible a claim that they, the Chinese, had won a military victory in Korea. He wanted that little boost right at the end of the war that could give their claims of military victory that much more credibility than the enemy. Heavy artillery barrage and massive, targeted infantry attacks were quickly successful, with ROKA units that had previously held strong broken just through the immense weight of the attack. Defending units were cut off from each other as the attackers adeptly moved up and across ridges in unexpected places. Given the dire situation and his previous realization that heavy casualties were not always worth the price, Taylor ordered a withdrawal of the ROKA divisions under attack, giving up the entire bulge to the Communists to save the ROKA from destruction. The attacks earlier in the spring and summer were still fresh in the minds of UN Command's officers, and they quickly realized that the lives lost in these hopefully final battles were not worth the price. That withdrawal went a bit too far, though, turning the bulge into enemy territory upside down, requiring a UN counterattack on the 16th to restore the front line along the Kumsong River, which was the best defensive position in the area anyway. After 3 days of fighting, the line was restored along the river, with every attempt to cross it rebuffed by the Communists on the other bank. In all, the PVA forced the UN line in this sector back 6 miles, and crucially, gave the Communists a more legitimate claim to have won a military victory in Korea. By the 20th of July, all was mostly quiet on the Korean front. Now, the job was to get it to stay that way. That would not last long, though, as the Chinese launched another attack in the west to strengthen their position north of Seoul just a few days later. These skirmishes, in and around the Nevada complex of ridges and valleys that we discussed last episode, were relatively minor affairs with just small pieces of territory changing hands. What does make them notable is that they would become the actual last battles of the Korean War. While Rhee's letter to Eisenhower worked its way through the American hierarchy, the Communists continued to delay the expected outcome as they launched the attack of July 13th. Harrison and co. walked away from Panmunjom on the 15th because of their correct assumption that Nam and co. were delaying at Panmunjom just to see how that offensive worked itself out. Later that day, Harrison received from Clark word that they had received a written assurance from Rhee that he would respect the truce and could thus inform Nam as much. The wording was tweaked to necessary assurances, but before Harrison even had the chance to tell Nam that, the Communists requested a recess until the 19th. And when they sat back down on that day, the line had shifted its greatest distance since the beginning of negotiations. But that was all behind them now, mostly. That 158th meeting ended with an agreement for the staff liaison officers to meet the next day and finalize the armistice. So, on the 20th, the Americans and Communists met and agreed to sign the Armistice Agreement in 7 days. The reason for the delay was because there were some minor technical issues that they needed to resolve. Those 4 minor technical details were, in no particular order, the actual location of the military demarcation line and the surrounding demilitarized zone, how to start the activities of the armistice commissions, the location to which each side would deliver repatriated POWs for the swap, and the details of the signing itself. The first matter was the line of demarcation, which was easy given much of the line had not moved in 18 months. The harder parts came when the discussion arrived on the areas so recently under attack by the Chinese. This specific aspect of the discussion took 3 further days of negotiations, whereupon a final map was signed and dated by each representative, then sent off for duplication, and that is the line that exists in Korea to this day. The arrangements for repatriate POWs was equally quick, with UN Command proposing an amendment to the final armistice agreement that would have non-repatriate POWs delivered to the relevant commission in the southern half of the demilitarized zone. The Communists counterproposed simply remanding non-repatriates to the commission on their respective sides of the demilitarized zone. Because this satisfied the spirit of what UN Command wanted, they agreed to it quickly and moved on to further details of repatriation. The Communists asked for an exact number of expected repatriates and non-repatriates, providing their own figure of 12,764 repatriate POWs. This figure was split about 1/3 American and 2/3 Korean, with a non-zero but pretty small number of non-American, non-Korean POWs. The Americans, cognizant of the last time they provided an exact figure to the Communists, only provided an estimate of 74,000 repatriates and 22,000 non-repatriates. Most of the repatriates, 69,000, were Korean, and most of the non-repatriates, 2/3, were Chinese. What I don't have is a breakdown of the origins of those non-repatriate POWs that the Rhee government released unilaterally that we discussed last episode. Next, the 2 sides discussed the rate at which the prisoners would be returned. This rate just because of the vast difference between the number of prisoners held by each side, was going to be unequal in absolute terms, but each side wanted to roughly match each other in the relative rate of delivery. The two colonels, Louis Friedersdorf and Li Pyong-il, negotiating this specific item, went back and forth, with Li adamant that his side had the capacity to deliver just 300 prisoners a day. Friedersdorf first offered 1,800 a day from UN Command, plus 360 sick and wounded, to which Li requested 3,000 a day. These figures were built around the amount of prisoners held, the transportation networks between the delivery zones and the camps, and the distance between the camps and the demilitarized zone. A recalculation upped the UN command number to 2,400, but Li again requested 3,000. Friedersdorf flat out refused, and Li finally accepted 2,400, plus the 360 sick and wounded. And that's roughly equal, with the Communists returning 2.4 of their prisoners each day, and UN Command delivering 2.9% each day, which is a reasonable compromise. With those expected numbers, though, the Communists would take 40 days to deliver their POWs, compared to UN Command's 30 days. That 10-day difference does not appear to be much of a concern for Clark, Harrison, or Friedersdorf, so it's not really important. It's just a thing that UN Command accepted to get their guys back home. And I think it just shows that everyone just wanted to finish this agreement as soon as possible. In any set of negotiations, compromise and agreement on one issue often beget compromise and agreement on other issues. And so continued the final negotiations at Panmunjom, with the Communists quickly agreeing to UN Command's proposal for the Military Armistice Commission to convene the day after the signing of the armistice. So too did each side agree on the final arrangements for the actual signing ceremony. Back on the 20th, the Communists proposed that each commander separately sign the document, with the head delegates signing at Panmunjom to complete the agreement. So Kim and Peng would sign in their roles as commanders-in-chief of the KPA and PVA, and Clark would sign in his role as UN commander. Then, Nam and Harrison would sign at Panmunjom, once each copy arrived there to officially mint the armistice. Clark rejected that plan as soon as he heard about it, because he wanted each commander to be at the ceremony to give the occasion the legitimacy he thought it needed. If he was going to be the first American commander to end a war without a victory, then by golly, he wanted to do it right. The Communists rejected that idea out of security concerns on the 21st, before, on the 23rd, offering to have the armistice take effect 12 hours after each head delegate signed the document at Panmunjom, removing American concerns about the time, cost, and logistics of having each commander sign the document separately away from Panmunjom. The next day, the Communists outlined what it would take for Kim and Peng to sign at Panmunjom. Heavy limitations on the number of attendees, plus the exclusion of nationalist Chinese and South Korean representatives as well as members of the press. Clark wanted to accept these limits initially, but flipped after some internal self-deliberation. He wanted the press present for the ceremony, including members of the South Korean and nationalist Chinese press. That said, Rhee did not want any representatives of his government there, to ensure that responsibility for whatever happened after the armistice fell squarely on the shoulders of his American allies. On July 25th, the Americans again requested and the Communists again denied the presence of nationalist Chinese and South Korean reporters. If the Americans accepted that denial, then Ju Yan, the Communist representative, flatly stated that North Korean Defense Minister Cho Yong-gon and Peng would sign the armistice at 10 a.m. on the 27th. Ju's continued denial of those reporters' presence pushed Clark over the edge, and on the 26th, the UN commander told Harrison to sign the agreement the next morning. Clark would travel to the UN camp south of Panmunjom at Munsan-ni to sign the agreement himself after the ceremony. That afternoon, the two sides finally agreed to the last details. Each side could have 350 people in Panmunjom for the ceremony, with just 150 total allowed inside the building where the signing was to take place. The building and surrounding area were split in two, with each side constrained to its half to limit the potential for accidental conflict. The ceremony was set for 10 a.m. on the 27th, and 12 hours later, the Korean War was going to end. Except that was not all of the strings they needed to tie up. Right up until the hour before the ceremony started, Ju and his American counterpart, Colonel Murray, were negotiating the logistics of how the 18 physical copies of the agreement would be signed. They didn't have PDFs and email and DocuSign back then, so each copy needed to be signed with a pen, then handed off to the other side so they could sign. Each faction, UN Command, the PVA, and the KPA, would have 6 copies apiece, so Murray originally suggested the obvious choice. Each commander sign 6 at a time, then rotate to the next commander, then on to the final commander. Ju insisted that they divide the copies equally, with 2 commanders signing 9 at a time before rotating them. The logistics of that don't really make sense to me, but Murray agreed to it that morning, and the ceremony went forward as planned, just in the nick of time. The building constructed for the signing was also itself the subject of negotiations up to the day before the signing, with 2 peace doves placed by the Communists removed at the Americans' request. Also at the Americans' request, a second door was constructed on the southern side of the building, allowing UN representatives to enter the building without walking past the Communist representatives. Arrayed out from that southern entrance on the morning of the ceremony stood an honor guard, comprised of soldiers from each nation represented in UN command. Arrayed out from the northern entrance were Chinese and North Korean soldiers quickly cleaning brush and dirt away from the entrance one last time. As they entered, the Communists were rigid and formal. UN command representatives were much more informal upon their entrance. Just before the 10 o'clock hour, Harrison and Nam arrived by helicopter and jeep, respectively. Right at the stroke of 10, each entered the building from their respective entrances, sat at their tables, and methodically signed the 18 documents before them. After just 12 minutes of scribbling, each commander left the building without a word to the other. A few minutes later, Harrison and Nam left Panmunjom for good. The countdown to the end of the Korean War had now properly started, set for 12 hours. Later that day, after signing the Korean Armistice Agreement at Munsan-ni, Mark Clark spoke before the reporters, officers, and civilians present. He assured them that UN Command would remain in Korea until a full peace treaty was completed, and would remain ready to take up the fight again should the Chinese or North Koreans again act aggressively towards South Korea. While he spoke, along the front line, across the cloud-gray skies, and up and down the coast, UN artillery, aircraft, and ships continued to drop high explosives on Communist soldiers and infrastructure, hoping to limit their ability to rebuild quickly before the Inspection Commission began its work. And at 10 o'clock on the night of July 27, 1953, an uneasy calm settled across the peninsula as all the guns in Korea fell silent. Peace returned to Korea for the first time in 1,129 days. Now, the question was how long that peace would last. The Korean Armistice Agreement, as signed on the 27th, included 6 provisions. 1. Its main purpose, an indefinite ceasefire. 2. A military demarcation line stretching from the mouth of the Han River on the Yellow Sea northeast for 250 kilometers, surrounded by a 2-kilometer demilitarized zone on each side. 3. a military armistice commission to oversee the demilitarized zone. 4. A repatriation commission to oversee the proper disposition of repatriate and non-repatriate POWs. 5. A neutral nations supervisory commission to oversee the terms of the armistice in regards to repairs and replenishment made in North and South Korean territory. And 6. A recommendation for each government concerned to agree to hold a political conference within 3 months' time. The agreement did not make any specific plans for that political conference, and it was not a peace treaty between the concerned parties. It was simply a ceasefire agreement that should set the foundation for a political solution to the matter of Korean division. The next day, 110,000 people stood outside in the main square of Pyongyang, which was entirely destroyed in the war, so this was less a square and more a wasteland, all to witness Kim's victory speech. Kim extolled the virtue of the Korean people and their fight to defend themselves from the imperialist traitors. He thanked the Soviets and the Chinese for their assistance, and decried the South Koreans for running into the arms of the Americans and Japanese when their attack, the southern attack that he alleges started the war, failed so quickly. He gave all the credit for this victory to his people, while accepting all the credit himself. If his control had ever been questioned before the war, there was certainly no way for anyone to challenge his authority in North Korea after the war. Ri gave no such speech in Seoul, where he was still in Busan, but he gave no speech there either. South Korea had survived the onslaught, but there was no joy in that victory. Mao spoke to supporters in Beijing, congratulating them for their successful campaign to resist America and aid Korea, the official title for Chinese support of North Korea. Mao's image was on the rise from here on out, and he could do no wrong, say no wrong, and think no wrong anymore. His victory in the Korean War gave Mao the domestic and international legitimacy he so desperately craved, both for his country and for himself. Peng also spoke, but his victory would only take him so far, and he was purged from the government by Mao in 1959, tortured and beaten by various Maoist factions, and ultimately imprisoned until his death in 1974. Today, he is, I think rightfully, seen as one of the greatest Chinese generals, but only after a public image rehabilitation campaign led by Deng Xiaoping, Mao's successor. Eisenhower gave a brief address from the Oval Office, warning his countrymen that this was no victory, that world peace was still threatened. To ensure that peace as best each country could, the Soviet Union extended financial aid to North Korea for 1 billion rubles, and the United States signed a defensive treaty with South Korea in early August. The Cold War did not begin with the Korean War. The Korean War cemented the Cold War as the new international status quo. Before we move any further away from the end of the war, let's take stock of the immense human cost imposed on the two Koreas and their allies by this police action. Historian Wada Haruki estimates that from the 30 million Koreans living on the peninsula at the beginning of the war, the two Koreas lost 5 million residents between them through forced migration, combat, disease, and other miscellaneous causes. And I'm going with Wada's numbers because I think he's just a more trustworthy source on this specifically than more biased sources from the United States, China, and Korea. Wada does a really good job of drawing from different archives in the United States, in South Korea, and in China. And that's actually a big part of the problem, that there are so many numbers floating around. China and North Korea have never released accurate official numbers, so only estimates can be made about the human cost on that side of the parallel. What Wada estimates is that, going by 1949 population estimates, North Korea lost 2.7 million people, either from death or by their fleeing southward. He also cites a Soviet ambassador's report from 1954 that was only declassified in 2001, that North Korea lost 1.8 million people through migration, death, or other causes. So you can see that it's difficult to even get a decent range. Officially, 116,000 Chinese Communist volunteer soldiers died in Korea, but every decent scholar considers that number very low. Bruce Cummings and John Halliday estimate something like 1 million Chinese combat deaths, and U.S. official estimates place that number around 400,000. Because of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the subsequent declassification of Soviet military records, we do know that around 315 Soviet service members died in and above Korea. For UN Command, accurate figures are a bit more easily available, but only just a bit. WADA estimates South Korea lost 2.3 million residents during the war and suffered 237,686 combat deaths, while Cummings and Halliday estimate 47,000 South Korean combat deaths, and the Korean Ministry of Defense officially claims 137,899 combat deaths. The differences in those numbers are mostly down to inadequate record-keeping during the war, a large system of rapid, forced conscription, and a large number of ROKA personnel officially listed as missing in action. At the time of his writing, 2014, WADA placed his number for official American combat deaths at 33,629. That number has since gone up to 36,574, mostly because of a joint effort to repatriate American, South Korean, and North Korean remains back to their country of origin. That is really an honorable international diplomatic effort. That effort moves personnel officially listed as missing in action into the officially killed in action column, giving their families some form of closure. For the non-American, non-Korean contingent of UN Command, about 3,000 combat deaths were suffered, with the Commonwealth and Turkish units making up about half of that number. As I hope you can understand, I can't really give you a final tally of total combat deaths and civilian displacement, because everyone has different numbers. I mean, yeah, you can look on Wikipedia and see that their panoply of sources have between 2 and 3 million civilians killed, and between 500,000 and 1 million combat deaths. But again, that's a big range, and it all depends on who you believe more. At the end of the day, I don't think those numbers matter. Well, that's kind of dumb. Of course they matter. But what really matters more is that each of those numbers is massively huge, and each number impacts each of the families, each of the communities from which those numbers drew their victims. Both Koreas are permanently scarred because of this conflict, and that's not just because of the immense damage done to the roads and bridges and ports and railroads. It's because this war ripped sibling from sibling, parent from child, and family from home. That's what matters, and I hope I've done a good enough job conveying that cost. With the campaigns of war finished for the time being, the campaigns to rebuild the two Koreas began. On the 27th, Clark informed Rhee that Eisenhower was offering an immediate supply of 10,000 tons of food to stabilize the daily lives of South Korean civilians, which Rhee quickly accepted. Around the same time, the Soviets initiated their financial aid transfer. The Military Armistice Commission began its work of overseeing the demilitarized zone on the 28th, with all military personnel pulling back 2 kilometers from the military demarcation line. Those meetings quickly devolved along a similar path of the armistice negotiations, with representatives growing increasingly hostile towards each other throughout August, before settling into an icy state of affairs. The Supervisory Commission began its work in early August, but was quickly caught in a storm of accusations and counter-accusations that the Communists were violating the agreement about the number of allowed ports of entry. Nothing came of those accusations except to further strain the post-armistice status quo. The Repatriation Commission had probably the easiest time completing its duties, mostly because both sides wanted their POWs returned pretty quickly. Operation Big Switch, as the prisoner swap became known, began on August 5th, with UN Command repatriating 75,000 prisoners between the 5th and September 6th. In the same time, the Communists returned their 12,000 prisoners. And each side matched their expected number of repatriates pretty closely, and no major arguments arose from this post-armistice process. Later in September, each side delivered the non-repatriate prisoners to the Commission, with UN Command delivering 22,000 and the Communists delivering 350. Between September 23rd and December 23rd, when the previously agreed-upon 90-day period for convincing non-repatriates expired, the Communists had only changed the minds of 600 prisoners over the just 10 days they actually tried to do anything, with the rest choosing non-repatriation once again. Those prisoners were sent to Taiwan after a further 30 days, arriving in late January 1954 to a warm welcome by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government and a massive parade. 359 UN Command personnel chose non-repatriation, with just 10 switching their choice in the 90-day period. While never confirmed by the North Korean government, it is understood that up to 80,000 further South Korean POWs were held by the North Koreans after the end of the war, and remained in North Korea for the rest of their lives, serving as forced labor for the Kim government. Only a few of those men have since escaped to South Korea, and most have, probably, by this point, passed away with little to no record of their existence after their initial capture. That's a big part of why over 100,000 South Korean service members remain officially missing in action. The political conference, as outlined in the Armistice Agreement, began on October 26th, with the Chinese delegate proposing that the Soviet Union and India participate in the conference as neutral observers. The Americans balked at such a suggestion because they considered the Soviets a participant in the war, and the conference ended pretty quickly after that, before it was shelved indefinitely in January of 1954. It has never again been picked up by either side. What did happen, though, was that diplomatic officials from 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council agreed to hold a political conference to discuss the matter of international peace in East Asia in February of 1954, with the conference to be held in Geneva that April. This was a different conference than the one specifically outlined in the Armistice Agreement as signed. That conference opened on the 26th of April, with representatives from the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, North Korea, the United States, the United Kingdom, South Korea, and every other member of UN Command in attendance. The purpose of the Geneva Conference was twofold: to reach a political settlement on Korea, and to reach a political settlement on Indochina. The French had fought to reimpose French rule in their Southeast Asian colony since the end of World War II, and, by early 1954, failed. The discussions regarding the First Indochina War were the more successful discussion at Geneva, and that's often what this conference is known for, with no headway made regarding the question of Korea. Both Koreas were represented at the conference, and both arrived with a set of conditions for reunification. The South Koreans wanted reunification through reunification. Like Syngman Rhee. Sorry, I couldn't resist. The South Korean delegation wanted elections held under the UN and North Korean territory incorporated into the Republic of Korea, mostly because UN-sanctioned elections were already held in South Korea in 1948. The North Koreans wanted elections across the entire peninsula outside of the aegis of the UN, because of its status as a combatant in the war. Only the United States accepted the South Korean position, with all other UN Command allies preferring the North Korean position. But that was enough to sink the discussion for the first month of the conference. In late May, the South Korean delegation proposed elections across the entire peninsula, but they would still be under UN oversight. Because that was kind of the Communists' main issue with the proposal, they rejected this plan as quickly as they did the first. Talks finally fell apart on June 15th, with the UN Command allies publishing a statement that the conference had failed. Korea would remain divided. The temporary armistice was now indefinitely permanent. Now, I don't want to get into the last 70 years of Korean history because, well, that's kind of a lot. But I do want to discuss a brief overview just to give you an idea how the Korean War continues to echo through to the modern day. And the briefest of overviews is that, since July 1953, not much has changed. The Korean peninsula is still divided along the same military demarcation line agreed to at Panmunjom. The United States still guarantees South Korean security through UN Command, and the People's Republic of China continues to support North Korea as a buffer state to keep the Americans off their Manchurian border. Of course, the Kim government now has nuclear weapons, although there is an argument to be made about if these weapons could ever be used outside of Korea. But I get why the North Koreans wanted those weapons given the existential threat posed to the North Korean state by the United States, as they see it from Pyongyang. The economies of the two Koreas could not be more different today, with North Korea largely shut out of the global economy through harsh international sanctions, and South Korea a key player in East Asia's massive economic growth in the later decades of the 20th century. Of course, all that happened after Syngman Rhee was tossed out of office and, after the brief existence of the Second Republic, replaced by Park Chung-hee through a military coup. Park held the office of the president starting in 1962 until his assassination 17 years later, and oversaw massive economic growth under his authoritarian regime. And I think it's a small but important detail that Park's military career began not as an anti-colonial freedom fighter, but as a member of the Imperial Army of Manchukuo, the Japanese colonial state. This just reinforces the complicated legacy of Japanese colonialism in Northeast Asia, which is something that, if you are even slightly interested in, I highly recommend that you dive a bit deeper into it. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung purged many of the non-guerrillas from his government throughout the 1950s, eventually implementing economic and political self-sufficiency through his Juche ideology. This is the form of state communism that continues in North Korea to this day. It has resulted in a disastrously low quality of life for North Koreans compared to their southern counterparts. Of course, international sanctions play a part in that, but it's not really a chicken or egg argument that some might think it to be. Sanctions came after Juche, which was, as I understand it, part of Kim's plan to play the Chinese and Soviets off each other after the Sino-Soviet split and the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. Internationally, the Korean War proved to the United States that containment could work only if they were deeply involved. That's why we eventually went to Vietnam, and that's why we supported the anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan, which has worked out really great for us. Korea was also a massive blow to the American ego, being the first war we ever really lost, or at least did not win. And I don't think we've ever really recovered from that. But if that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't really know yet. It also really depends on your opinion of American primacy on the global stage. If you have a negative opinion, you'd probably think that the US not winning in Korea is a good thing, as the Americans probably deserve to be knocked down a peg or two. If you have a positive opinion, you'd probably think that the US not winning in Korea was a bad thing that shook our faith in ourselves and led to a perceived deterioration of American security that continues to this day. The Korean War gave Mao's government in Beijing the legitimacy needed to retake its place in the world as the China. Of course, full normalization would not come for another 20 years, but the People's Volunteer Army's role in, for lack of a better word, saving North Korea from destruction solidified Communist China's place both in the communist world and in its own mind. Although the war was fought to a standstill, this was effectively a Chinese victory over what many considered a superior American force. The propaganda value of this is still mined by the Chinese government today. I think understandably so, given that they joined the war just 1 year after they even became a country. That said, 18 months of negotiations could have been avoided if the Chinese were not as stubborn as they were on certain issues. Xu Guangzhong rightly attributes this to the diplomatic naivete of the communist military leaders that caused a great deal of unnecessary bloodshed during the periods of their intransigence on issues like prisoners of war. I agree with that, because a good length of the negotiations could have been avoided, and the Chinese would still have fought the Americans to a standstill. They could have gotten their desired benefits from the war without losing a few 100,000 young men to combat. Korea also gave the Chinese a big mental boost that jump-started the end of the century of Chinese humiliation. Mao saw this as the first step in restoring China to, again, what he saw as its rightful place in world politics. Mao might have been a different type of Chinese leader, but he was certainly influenced by long-standing Chinese goals in terms of international politics and diplomacy. The Korean War gave Mao the self-confidence and enough authoritarian legitimacy to implement both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution in an attempt to leapfrog Chinese industry and society past that of the United States. As we know now, those both failed, but that Mao is still so revered a figure in China shows that the legitimacy he earned in Korea just might spring eternal. All that said, the question of who won the Korean War is a dangerously loaded question. And that's kind of because technically the war is still going on, no peace agreement has ever been signed. But it's also because there are serious arguments to be made that both everyone involved and no one involved won the Korean War. Both Koreas failed in their goals of unification. The United States and China failed to win a military victory, and the Soviet Union failed to spin this war into a wider war against their anti-communist enemies. But also, both Koreas survived the war. The United States proved that aggressive communism could be stopped, and that the UN could actually do something compared to the League of Nations. China proved that it could go toe-to-toe with a bona fide superpower and come out on the other side. The Soviet Union proved that it could take a step back and let other communist parties act as the vanguard around the world, limiting the threat to the Soviet heartland. So I guess that's probably the best way to end this episode, to end this series, by concluding that everyone won something in Korea and everyone lost something in Korea. I understand that's kind of unsatisfying, but I never promised a satisfying end. These things aren't always tied up with a neat bow because there are so many different strands all pulled together in one disastrous moment that then move forward and go their own ways. And there's always more strands. History has not yet ended. I hope, if you've gotten anything out of these last 34 episodes, is that any event in history is just a group of people making good and bad decisions that eventually draw together multiple historical strings into that one event, and then those strings spread back out on their separate ways. Maybe they'll join back together again someday, maybe not. Who knows? And that's where we'll leave our discussion, with the Korean Peninsula settling into a tense state of affairs that remains the status quo to this day. Next episode, we will discuss, well, what's left, really. And you can listen to that episode right now. Mostly, it'll be a bit about my thoughts on this series in general, some reading recommendations, and finally, what's next for this podcast. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. You can also find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.